welcome. I'd like to get started. My name is Jeff Colgan. I'm a professor here in political science, and it is my distinct pleasure and privilege, really, to introduce Leah Stokes, who is going to speak with us today. Leah is the Anton Vonk Associate Professor of Environmental Politics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She completed her PhD at MIT in public policy, and within American politics, her work focuses on representation and public opinion, voting behavior, and public policy. She's the author of the book Short-Circuiting Policy, which focuses on the role that utilities have played in, unfortunately, obstructing a lot of the kind of pro-climate policies that we would like to see. The book won a whole series of awards, which I can't even get through the list, but one of them was the best energy book of 2020 by the American Energy Society. It was named one of the top 5 climate books by this little publication you might have heard of, the New York Times, and it won 3 separate awards in the American Political Science Association. She has not only published that book, but also articles in journals like the American Political Science Review and the American Journal of Political Science and Nature Energy, but also publications like the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, The Atlantic, CNN, etc. So just a tremendous kind of bridging of both really serious academic research and, as you will hear, some public-facing work as well. In 2022, Leah was named an advocate on the Time Top 100 list, and perhaps most importantly, she is Canadian American, which, as we all know, are good people, and so it is my pleasure to welcome you to Brown University, Leah Stokes. Thanks.
This morning. That's so funny. We did a podcast this morning. In the middle of it, I thought he has a Canadian accent, which when you're Canadian, you can hear the Canadian accent. It's like a secret thing. Well, it's so wonderful to be here. I have a lot of colleagues here at Brown University, and so it's wonderful to be here with all of you. And a special thanks to Jeff for inviting me to come. And yeah, it's just great to be here with all of you. So today I'm going to talk about my experience working on the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, as you probably know, a very big climate law that was passed last summer. It, of course, also includes tax reform, prescription drug reform, and I don't know if people saw this, but Eli Lilly said that they're going to cap insulin costs yesterday, which is something that they didn't manage to get fully through the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's super, super exciting. So it's a really big law. I worked on some pieces of the climate part of it. So I'm going to talk about, what did I see about how this law managed to get passed. So the 3 things that I'm going to talk us all through is sort of like a classic public policy framework of sort of agenda setting, getting things on the agenda, alternative specification, defining what we're actually going to do, what is the policy, and then enactment, getting the law across the finish line. And I want to kind of explain how each of these stages played out in practice. So in terms of agenda setting, what we really saw was these activist groups organizing nationally to get climate onto the Democratic primary. I'll talk about that dynamic, but the presidential primary, which a lot of people dismiss as kind of not important for policymaking, became really central actually to setting the agenda for climate legislation. In terms of alternative specification, once President Biden won and the Georgia runoffs took place in January 2021, there was a lot of close coordination between advocacy group networks to produce sort of consistent, disciplined public and private messaging in terms of what the movement wanted on climate, what was necessary. And then in terms of enactment, a lot of environmental experts, both inside and outside of Congress, use the media to generate public pressure and help sort of privately put pressure onto the Democrats to not take this off the agenda. And I'll talk a bit about that. So agenda setting in the Democratic primary. If you think back to 2019, before the pandemic, I know there was a before time, and in that time, there was a lot of people running for president. I think it was something like 22 people or some historic number of Democrats actually entered the presidential primary. You may remember, like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, was running as a Democrat for the presidential primary at one point. And Beto O'Rourke actually put out the first climate plan pretty early on in 2019. I want to say something like April or something like that. And I happened on that day to say that I wanted to summarize it and evaluate it and provide a little description about what was in the plan. And I don't know why particularly I decided to do that, but I wrote about it on Twitter and it kind of went viral. And then from then on, I did it for all the plans, and there ended up being a lot of plans. And it wasn't just me sort of evaluating climate plans, there were activist groups doing it too. So for example, the Sunrise Movement, which some of you may be part of or know about, used the Democratic primary as a way to evaluate candidates and push them to do more. So here's an example of the scorecard that Sunrise did. As you can see, they gave Biden a failing grade initially for his climate plan. But it wasn't just Sunrise either. There were a lot of efforts by the media and nonprofit groups to summarize like what was actually in these climate plans. What makes a climate plan ambitious or not ambitious? What do we have to do to actually take on the climate crisis? And these questions ended up pushing the candidates to go farther and put forward more ambitious plans. So here you can see, for example, that different candidates said what they would do by what timeline. They put a certain amount of money on the table, and then groups like Greenpeace and Data for Progress and the League of Conservation Voters went and evaluated what they were doing. For example, the LCV score is actually probably based on the voting records, because LCV does voting record scores for members of Congress, like Elizabeth Warren was at the time. And as I mentioned, I wrote a lot of these threads that basically every time a new plan came out, I would summarize it, break it down. A lot of the media started reading what I was writing, and then they would ask me to describe things. I wrote some monkey cage blogs, which is a political science blog in the Washington Post about it. And it was funny because Biden eventually, after all these other candidates put out plans, eventually he improved his plan. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And this is the thread that I wrote on his second plan, and the campaign actually was like, when are you going to write the thread saying that our plan is better, because we're like waiting for you to do that. So it's really funny to sort of become this expert evaluator of a certain sense and to use my knowledge about climate policy for something applied. And I didn't really plan to do this. It just kind of started to happen, and it became a kind of race to the top of a lot of different people and groups sort of evaluating what these candidates were doing. And that was maybe the benefit of having 20 people, right? It was like letting 1,000 poppies bloom, right? You had all these different flowers, and people could say, well, that's interesting or that's not interesting. In addition, the media was super important to drawing attention to climate change. Several journalists, including Brian Kahn and Emily Atkin, actually called for there to be a climate debate. Because in the normal debates through the Democratic primary, there would usually be, let's say if it was an hour-long debate or 90 minutes, there would be something like half an hour on healthcare, maybe half an hour on the economy, and then like one question about climate change. It's like, do you think we should take away your hamburgers? This was the sort of state of the discourse. And a bunch of climate journalists, like those that I mentioned, said that's not sufficient. Like, this is a really complex and important topic, and we should have a whole debate on it. Those two journalists didn't end up hosting that debate because of various things with their outlets that they were working on, but the idea got picked up by MSNBC and CNN, and you can see what these were. I live tweeted them all, and it was like, I don't know, 6 hours straight of like presidential candidates having to talk coherently for like half an hour at a time about climate. And imagine what it was like to prep to go to one of these town halls. Finally, a candidate has to actually know something about climate policy to the extent that they have to be able to speak intelligently about it on live television for like half an hour. And all of the candidates could do that for healthcare policy, no problem. All of them could do it for foreign policy. All of them could do it for economic policy, but most of them could not do it for climate policy. And so this was not just important in terms of like, getting media attention to the issue, informing the public. It was actually important to putting pressure on the candidates themselves to make climate a central part of their expertise and of their platforms. Very important was that Governor Jay Inslee decided to enter the race. And I showed a picture of Jay Inslee to my undergrads this week, and I said, does anybody know who this is? And no one did, which is sort of sad, but it doesn't matter in a certain sense, because whether or not you know who he is, he has had an indelible mark on climate policy, because he's the governor of Washington State, including currently, and he had been working for most of his career. He used to be a representative in Congress to make climate change like an important issue. And he decided to enter the race for president, and he hired a bunch of his former staffers, including Sam Ricketts and Bracken Hendricks and Jamal Rod, to work for him on his campaign. And Sam Ricketts, who ended up becoming a very close friend of mine, kind of took this as like the most exciting master's thesis he'd never written before, in that he wrote 200 pages of ideas about what to do on climate policy. They put out 5 major climate plans. So it wasn't just like, okay, I did my climate plan, move on. It was like, okay, here's climate plan number 1, and here's climate plan number 2. And so those ideas ended up, getting in the news cycle. They came up with the idea of a civilian climate corps, for example. They came up with the idea of hitting 100% clean power by 2035. And it continued the media attention on it and put pressure on other campaigns to do more. And when Governor Inslee did not become president, because he did not, what happened was that they decided to start an organization called Evergreen Action. And they basically thought that the campaign for climate was not over. Yes, the campaign to get a specific human being was over, but the campaign for climate was not over. And I was so inspired by the work that they were doing that I ended up becoming part of Evergreen and really joining with their efforts to basically have a campaign not to elect a specific person to be president, but to get climate policy enacted. And the interesting thing was that when they dropped out, they became very quickly like a think tank to other campaigns. So the Warren campaign, for example, literally wholesale adopted a bunch of Inslee's ideas, and eventually so did President Biden. So it's interesting how much failure, in a certain sense, a candidate who didn't win still leads to massive shifts in what we sort of think about. Is it an important topic, or what substantively we're going to do about it? And the long story short of this is it created a dynamic race to the top where candidates were trying to outdo each other. I forgot about this until I looked it up yesterday, but when President Biden introduced his first climate plan, it got roasted by activists. And I think I was part of that roasting. I remember now with hindsight, which is too bad, because I first moved to the United States when when Biden was running for vice president with Obama, and I loved him. I don't know why, but the fact that he swore and he said what was on his mind, I don't know, people probably don't remember the reputation that he used to have, but he was a real, like, say it how you think it kind of guy. And that really resonated with me, but he lost some of that for some reason in this particular campaign, and young people were not very excited about Biden. He just wasn't really exciting people. And so when he first came out with his climate plan, it got terribly roasted. And one thing folks quickly noticed is that it had plagiarism in it, that it had included literal verbatim parts from like carbon capture and sequestration reports by other organizations. I completely forgot about this. And this was controversial because when Biden had previously run for president, I think in the 80s, his campaign basically ran into hot water and he had to quit because of plagiarism. So it's funny. I'm glad for him and for the plan and for our democracy that that's not how it all played out here. Instead, what happened was that pressure on the campaign was really put towards useful ends. And as I mentioned, he came out with a much better plan that adopted a bunch of ideas from the Bernie Sanders campaign, of course, from the Inslee campaign. What actually happened is that they set up a kind of unity task force when it became clear that Biden was going to be the candidate. And folks like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Sunrise Movement co-founder Varshini Prakash, Gina McCarthy, who ended up going back into the admin, all these people, John Kerry, they are all on this process of trying to figure out what should we do on climate. And they came up with a bunch of ideas, and it ended up being in Biden's plan. So it became a lot more ambitious, and this was really a function of the activism in the primary. Okay, so that's how we got this idea onto the agenda, so to speak. That's how we put pressure on climate being a really important democratic issue. How then did folks come up with what to do exactly? Well, a lot of that did happen in the primary, but it got fleshed out a lot more once the Democrats took control of the Senate after the Georgia runoffs. So Biden won, you may remember that, he became president. And the really cool thing was the Inslee idea of 100% clean power by 2035 became a key part of what folks were demanding. And President Biden said that he would do that he would go for 100% clean power by 2035. He talked about it a lot on the campaign trail. They made ads about it. This graphic is actually something that I kind of created. Folks call it the narwhal curve. And it's a basic idea of here are we at with how much clean energy we have now, and here's where we need to go. And you can see it's a rather steep slope, but it was exciting to just have something really ambitious on the table. And so a bunch of groups started to write reports, essentially, and not so much reports to sit on the shelf, but ideas. I was involved in a bunch of these reports, and what we would do substantively is we would call people up and we would say, okay, we're going to have budget reconciliation, and this was in the summer of 2020 before the election. How exactly, what can we do on climate with budget reconciliation? Let's say we wanted to do 100% clean power by 2035. How are we going to advance that through budget reconciliation? We learned all about the Byrd rule and interviewed like Senate parliamentarian experts. And I didn't know anything about this stuff, to be honest. I'd written one paper about Congress, but I'll be totally honest, I didn't know what all the relevant committees were and which committee went to that, because it's not like I'd been a congressional staffer. But I teamed up with Sam Ricketts, who co-founded Evergreen and had written all those policy ideas on the Inslee campaign. And he had worked in Congress for a decade, knew everybody, knew every committee, knew how to navigate the whole landscape. And so we worked together, where I brought a lot of the ability to kind of interview people and figure out solutions and bring folks together in coalitions and do media work. And he brought a lot of like the deep knowledge and relationships and expertise about how Congress worked and how to navigate that institution. And I learned an enormous amount working with him. So we published this report, A Roadmap to 100% Clean Electricity by 2035 in February, right after the Georgia runoff. Interestingly, we've been writing this in 2020, and then when the Senate kind of got hung because the Georgia runoffs, Sam said, oh, we're not going to do that report anymore. I said, I think we should keep writing it, because like, what if, we got arguments about it or whatever. And then when January 5th happened, I was like, see, we got to keep writing this. And so on January 6th, when all the insurrection stuff was happening, we're like watching it on TV and we're like, okay, yeah, but we got to keep writing our report about clean electricity, because this report needs to be done yesterday. So it was a funny, like crazy moment for the democracy and for our country, but another day where I was just like heads down trying to figure out how we were going to make progress. And other groups, like for example, the Center for American Progress and Rewiring America, which I later got involved in, they were figuring out how we were going to decarbonize our buildings. There were groups like the Zero Emission Transportation Association, ZETA, which was figuring out how to do clean cars along with Senator Schumer's office. So a lot of groups are basically biting off a piece of the climate puzzle and figuring out like, what do we actually want to do substantively in that area? And it's interesting to think about how this happened. So folks know that the Paris Agreement was a global negotiation that happened in 2015. This is part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it's this long process that dates back to 1992, where countries get together and they're like, what are we going to do about climate? And they mostly don't do that much, and they talk a lot, and it's frustrating. But the Paris Agreement was this really exciting time, because because the global negotiators agreed that they would try to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And that was important because then scientists could calculate, okay, if that's what you want to do, world, here's what you have to do. You have to cut carbon pollution by 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. So you could say you basically have to cut carbon pollution in half this decade. And so that became something that was understandable to people, right? This is something I can tell you. If you would like to limit warming, you need to cut carbon pollution in half this decade. That is a sentence that you can understand. It's not like the IPCC, hundreds of pages, very complex. Some scientists actually didn't like this because a lot of folks got freaked out about we only have 12 years and what are we going to do? But it boiled it down to something that was very understandable through the media to politicians, and it created a benchmark that you could then basically track against. Are we going to meet it or are we not going to meet it? So although I have been quite skeptical of the international negotiation process, I think this is an example of where something like getting that 1.5 degree target was hugely important. And that was a lot of small island nations that worked really hard to get that on the agenda. And it has had big repercussions for what the United States is doing. Because basically activists, this is another picture of Sunrise Movement, adopted this target. They said, you know, we have 12 years, what's your plan? And again, as I mentioned, a lot of scientists don't like this language, but to me, it simplifies the problem. It creates a sense of urgency. This was back in 2018 when there was a sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office and the Sunrise Movement really got launched nationally in a big way. And it was a way of saying, there's a target and there's a deadline. Are you going to meet it or are you going to not? And then that causes the president to have to say, well, what's he going to do as the United States contribution to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees? And so he committed early on through executive action that the Biden administration would try to cut carbon pollution in half, 50 to 52% this decade. And that's what this says. And so then the legislature, specifically Schumer's office and the media, start to benchmark against the target, right? So we have a global target, activists are like, let's do it. The president then does it. And now we can say, all right, does this bill meet the climate test or does it not? Are we going to cut carbon pollution in half or are we not going to? So this is an example of something that Leader Schumer's office put out in the middle of the negotiations in like mid 2021. And what you can see here is at that time, the package that they put together was going to cut carbon pollution by 45% below 2005 levels. So get us most of the way, like 90% of the way to that 50% cut, right? It's pretty easy math. People can understand what you're talking about. It's the kind of thing that media could write stories about. So constantly you get called, is this enough? Does it go far enough? Da, 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 da. And the cool thing was that the Schumer office had several, and still has several fantastic people in it who literally just would build a giant spreadsheet where they'd say, okay, here's the project, here's the line item in what was then Build Back Better. And here's how much money we have. And here's our best guess based on some model somebody did about how much that's going to cut carbon pollution. And so then we can get a sense of like, if we lose this program, here's how much we're going to lose in terms of ambition. Here's how much this program delivers per dollar spent. So they could basically say, if we want to maximize carbon pollution for every dollar that we're spending, you know, not to the exclusion of everything else, but at least as one goal alongside, for example, equity, you know, how do we make sure that we're not cutting programs that are essential to meeting our goal and, you know, keeping programs that aren't that essential? And so this is really, it's a fascinating example of policy making where really science and modeling was at the heart of what was the guiding light, essentially, like the North Star for the policy making process. So a lot of how this alternative specification happen and keeping it on the agenda happen was actually through coalition networks and strategy. I've spent like 17 years working on climate change now, and it was really only in the last, I don't know, 3-4 years that I started to develop a framework, a mental model that clarified the solution for me in a big way. Basically, and I wrote a bunch of stories about this around the time of the Inslee campaign and started to kind of think about it. But if you can get to 100% clean electricity and you can electrify all the sectors that you can, so that is transportation, mostly, buildings, about half of heavy industry. If you combine all those carbon cuts, you get to 75% of the solution. So in other words, electricity itself is about 25% of our carbon pollution, transportation is another 25%, and then buildings plus heavy industry make up that last quarter. So clean electricity plus electrification is this huge solution. So I thought to myself, okay, I want to work on clean electricity and electrification. And so I've also been learning by writing a book about how advocates had managed to pass clean electricity laws at the state level, that a big part of their success was networks, that they worked together. They weren't just sort of having one organization in a silo in one state, that they built these networks, especially in the 1990s, to cross-pollinate and meet and talk. And so I thought, okay, that's what we have to do. We have to build infrastructure for folks to coordinate. And so that's what we did. I helped set up 2 networks, one on electricity that still exists today. It has several hundred groups that are part of it, and Evergreen runs as sort of the anchor organization to it. And I'll talk a little bit more about how they were meeting, but it's been a wildly successful sort of network building group. We also set up an electrification group with Rewiring America called the Federal Electrification Policy Coalition, which is really the first electrification group federally of nonprofits to focus not just on energy efficiency, but electrification and trying to shift that paradigm. And if folks are interested, I'm always happy to talk about the energy efficiency versus electrification paradigm. There were other groups that other folks had set up, including years prior. So in environmental justice, for example, there was a big effort after the Waxman-Markey bill where there was a lot of fragmentation between the big greens and the environmental justice groups at the end of the day, to set up more relationships. And so many years ago now, they set up the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, which is a coalition of EJ groups and big greens. And that group in particular spent a lot of their time making sure that there were EJ priorities in the bill. And more generally within the climate movement, there's something called the Climate Action Campaign, which is where the big greens and some EJ groups, but mostly big greens, coordinate their work too. So there started to be basically infrastructure of networks of folks actually talking to one another, getting on the same page, coordinating their advocacy. So it's like, okay, who's talking to Hickenlooper's office? Who's talking to Sinema's office? Who's talking to Manchin? Who's the best position to do that? You know, what are we hearing in terms of support? A way to basically spread the resources of the movement more efficiently across all the different targets that had to be hit. And so a lot of this, another thing that I had read at the time, which I thought was really important, was that when the Waxman-Markey bill died, Peter Skocpol, a very important political scientist and sociologist at Harvard, had written this post-mortem. She was funded to write a white paper. It's never really been published as an academic piece, but it's a white paper, where she said, well, why did Waxman-Markey die? And one thing that stuck with me from that article was that there was not an outside game, that it was a very inside baseball, environmental defense fund sort of negotiating what they wanted and not really worrying about selling it to the people or getting grassroots energy behind it. So I was always very paranoid that we had to have organizing and energy. And thankfully there were groups like Sunrise Movement, which didn't exist before, it existed in 2009, that had that same worry, that they had also read the Skocpol article and were similarly worried about it. So these groups involved like weekly meetings with a bunch of subgroups on Hill work. So as I mentioned, they'd have a spreadsheet of all the different targets. They'd say, okay, who's talking to which office, who's got meetings, who's got relationships, and would coordinate to basically divide up the House caucus and the Senate caucus. An organizing subgroup, which, for example, planned protests and rallies and phone calls and letters and a lot of things like that. A comms group, which did a lot of media work. So earned media, trying to play stories. We would, for example, if we heard a senator wasn't being good on climate, we sort of try to place a hit job on them in the media, which is a lot of fun. And this was a lot of what the campaign people were good at, right? Because that's what campaign folks do. They like do media. They like go to an event, get a story about their person. That's what they do. So they were really exceptional at doing that, especially Jamal Rod at Evergreen Action. And the other thing that we did differently is, unlike Environmental Defense Fund in 2009, which had a very closed one organization working sort of inside with the administration and the Hill on a policy, was a very open policy design. So folks were talking to one another, writing reports together, getting feedback, soliciting ideas. And that, I think, brought a lot more groups along because folks felt like they had a hand in the final bill. Okay, so that's kind of how the alternatives were sort of developed. And what about enactment? How did the climate package actually pass? I was talking to Mark about this earlier, but I always believed that we were going to pass the bill. The only time I didn't believe we were going to do it was when Joe Manchin walked away from the negotiating table on July 17th or whatever day it was last summer, because my friend who was in Schumer's office, I heard he was crying. And I started crying, and if he was crying, then things were bad. And that day when we heard that news, I got a call from the New York Times in like 5 minutes, and I gave a very angry quote about Joe Manchin and sobbing, and it was very dramatic. And then I stayed up till midnight, even though I have like infant twins, and it was very stressful. And I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times where I just said, Joe Manchin is a terrible human being, and he may leave his children money and his grandchildren money, but he will also leave them a broken planet. And I don't know how he looks his grandchildren in the eyes. And, it was also people like John Podesta, who now works in the White House, interestingly, again, very important Democratic person. He was the chief of staff in the White House in Obama, and of course worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign. And anyway, John Podesta is a very, very important Democratic operative. And he was on Twitter saying, Joe Manchin's a terrible human being. And Christy Goldfuss, who was like a right-hand person of John Podesta's, was saying the same thing. So when people who are at the heart of the Democratic Party are calling out Joe Manchin, that it's like leave it all in the field, kind of blood on the track sort of thing. And people felt very betrayed because he had been on again, off again. We all called it the Manchin coaster. It was so exhausting. So yeah, anyway, that's the only time I didn't think it was going to pass, that 10-day period. And hilariously enough, in that 10-day period, Hickenlooper was like, we still got to try. And Smith was like, we're still trying. And these senators would run off and still try. And so I'd be like, are we still trying? And I would text my friend who worked for Schumer, and I'd be like, I hear we're still trying. And secretly, he was in the basement with Manchin's team that whole 10-day period. And he was just bluffing me out. It's hilarious to read my text messages back because he's like, oh, I don't know, I'm just watching Star Wars, and like pretending like he's not negotiating a deal. And at 1:55 p.m. Pacific, which is 4:55 Eastern on, I think it was July 27th or 29th, 27th, I think, I got a text message from him, which was a celebration emoji. I was reading to my infant twins this book, Every Day, Everywhere, Babies Are Born, which I have memorized because I have read it so many times. I was just living in the post-climate package depressive state, reading to my children in the middle of the day. And I get a celebration emoji. And I'm like, I'm going to swear now. I said, what the fuck does this mean? In front of my children, I just kept saying, what the fuck? What the fuck? Why would he send me this? He wouldn't just send me this. And about 2 minutes later, my friend in the White House sent me a link to a Manchin press release on his website called the Inflation Reduction Act, at which point I said, what the fuck is the Inflation Reduction Act? And then, it was all on again, which was fabulous. It was the best feeling ever. So I've sort of skipped ahead, but basically, Schumer at the beginning of 2021 went on MSNBC Rachel Maddow's show, and she said, what is your priority? And he said, climate change is my number one priority. And we were all like, yeah, go Schumer. And, he worked so hard. And the person I'm telling the story about is one of his climate staffers. And, they just never stopped trying. And the first thing that happened was the Biden administration put out the American Jobs Plan, which was the first attempt to define what was going to be part of the legislative package. Eventually, they decided they didn't like that name very much for whatever reason, and they went back to Build Back Better, which was the campaign sort of branding. This got taken up in the House, and I helped design a couple key parts of the law, including the Clean Electricity Performance Program and some home electrification stuff. And at one point, Gina McCarthy, who was in the White House at the time, said she didn't know if they were going to be able to get climate in the bill or not. And, they might have to leave this big electricity thing on the chopping room floor. And the folks at Evergreen, we all got on the phone and we were like, very upset about this. And so Senator Markey went on television that night and he said, no climate, no deal. If you don't put climate in this package, this reconciliation package, we're not having a reconciliation package. And because Evergreen had such brilliant comms people, they said, that's a slogan, that's a campaign slogan, no climate, no deal. And they partnered with Sunrise, and within 24, 48 hours, they've stood up a whole website, no climate, no deal. And they asked all the senators and the members of Congress to come out and say, are you gonna vote for a bill if there's no climate in it? And it became a kind of like evaluation point to keep the pressure up, where you basically didn't just have a veto of Senator Manchin saying, I get to do everything. You had a bunch of other senators saying, no, if you don't do climate, we're not gonna go along. The other thing that we did was, I had Theta Scotchbowl's writing in the back of my head telling me that if I didn't have an outside gain, we were going to get screwed. And so I went around calling up all the big nonprofits like Sierra Club and some of the folks that were tied to the campaign who then became independent operations. And I was like, are you going to do a caller? Are you going to get people to call Congress? I really think we have to get people to call Congress. And they were all like, I don't know. I don't think so. And I was like, how about yeah? How about yeah? How about yeah? And I was like tearing my hair out. And finally somebody said to me, well, why don't you call up Jamie Henn? Jamie Henn founded 350 with Bill McKibben. He's an awesome person. He started something called Fossil Free Media. It's a really small shop and they just kind of like do campaigns. In fact, today I saw him tweeting about Willow. There's a fight over trying to block a permit for an oil project in Alaska right now that the Biden administration might greenlight in the next couple days or weeks. Anyway, so I called up Jamie Henn. I was like, Jamie, we need to have a caller. He's like, we need to have a caller. And it's like, finally, I found my person with no money, $0. We built a website. We set up a phone number with Duncan Meisel as well. And we said, here's our 4 priorities, call for climate. I was very pregnant and I filmed myself in my own house calling my own senators as a video, and then I edited it myself. I have never edited a video before or after, but I was like, this has to happen. I have no money or anybody to help me, so I will make a video, put it online, and we generated like 15,000 phone calls to Congress all throughout this time period, keeping pressure on Congress. And that might not sound like a lot, but phone calls are really powerful into Congress. You know, everybody can do a form letter, sign a petition, click a button, but I was doing actually research on Congress at the same time where we were talking with offices about like, what kinds of contact do you care about? And we learned that they really care about phone calls. So I was like, sweet, let's generate a lot of phone calls. So we did that to kind of keep the pressure up. And it's just an example of, you know, that didn't cost no money, $0. And I mean, they had to spend a little bit of money on the caller, but they didn't have a grant to do it or anything like that. They just decided to put money towards it. Eventually, folks may know this, Nancy Pelosi has passed 3 climate bills in her time, bless her. And so in November, they finally got a climate bill over the finish line. It was $555 billion. And it really delivered a massive amount of the greenhouse gas savings that were necessary. And so this is, for example, a figure that Climate Power made, which was sort of a war room for climate, and that Lori Lotus runs. And it gave you a sense of, you know, here's the package, here's all the different pieces of it, and here's how they contribute to the big goal. And, you know, this might seem complicated, but reading a bill is way more complicated. And again, having that benchmark of we have to cut carbon pollution in half was a way to get the media sort of talking about it and focusing on why we have to do this bill and we can't just plant trees, for example, as the Republican Party was proposing. I already sort of told you this story, but basically Manchin said he wasn't going to do it. We all cried. A bunch of people yelled at him, told him he was a bad person. Bill Gates and Larry Summers called him up. And the interesting thing too about this dynamic was, you know, the Wednesday night, he said it wasn't going to happen. Thursday, that night, we all said he was a horrible human being. And then, or maybe it was Thursday night, we all said he was a horrible human being. And my op-ed ran all day, Saturday and Sunday on the cover of the paper. And I got 3,500 hate messages from the right. It was like, you know, because I think they thought this is effective, you know, like actually shaming somebody. And by Monday, Manchin had secretly gone back and restarted the negotiations. And then in that 10-day time period, because it went on from that Monday till the following Wednesday, Folks like Bill Gates called him up and Larry Summers called him up. And, there were folks bringing like Hickenlooper and Smith bringing in inflation numbers, and folks who were his pollster giving him data about inflation. And the cool thing was that the opponents, the fossil fuel industry, all thought they lost. And so they kind of went home and like chilled out. The fact that it was done so secretly actually gave space for the negotiation to happen, because he wasn't hearing every day from the fossil fuel industry, because they kind of thought that it was dead. And then out of nowhere, there's that press release, the Manchin supports the Inflation Reduction Act thing that I swore a lot about earlier. On July 27th, there you go. As you can see, I lived this very intensely. That's why I know all the dates of these things that happen. It was very important to get out there quickly and say, this is a good bill, this delivers what we need, we got to keep going. And so Evergreen Action, as a very rapid response organization that was built out of a campaign, knows how to operate like a campaign, did that. We called up 25 news outlets within hours of the press release going up, told them all what we thought. I went on TV, like we just really dominated the airwaves. We wrote this explainer, which has been downloaded, 10,000 plus times, which is still quite relevant. If you'd like to know what's in the Inflation Reduction Act, this is a really good explainer. It's like 11 or 12 pages, but it gets into all the details. And we try to explain to people what was in it. Now, this did piss off some groups because they didn't want to pass the law and they felt that we were too fast in saying that we liked it. And, that created conflict. So what is in the IRA? There are clean electricity investments. I'm going to give you 5 buckets, and this is the way the Schumer folks explained it too. So there are long-term extensions of tax credits that have been bedrock policies to build wind and solar, and now they've been expanded to batteries. Importantly, these are uncapped, so it's as much money as we can spend. And technically, actually, these last longer than 10 years because Senator Wyden did some fancy, interesting stuff. There is money to replace coal plants. This was quite quiet, and a lot of folks didn't realize it was in the bill, but there's $18 billion to help shut down coal plants, which is fantastic. Industrial policy, a really big priority of the Schumer team was to actually reshore clean energy technologies here in the United States. So wind and solar and batteries and electric vehicles and heat pumps, my personal favorite, building all of these things here in the United States. These are uncapped again, so it's hard to know how much will be spent, but it's estimated to be about 60 billion, and it's a lot of domestic manufacturing, including those targeted to coal communities. And so when we ask, why did Manchin go for it? At the end of the day, there was actually things he wanted in the bill. He wanted, this is 48C, for example, this is a program that says if you're a historic coal mining community, you can get additional money to do clean energy manufacturing. Working with Rewiring America, we helped put pressure on President Biden to invoke the Defense Production Act in the spring. Then we learned that there's no money. Yay, he invoked the Defense Production Act, but so what on a certain level, which was kind of a bummer. So then we got $250 million for heat pumps, which will hopefully start the first domestic manufacturing of heat pumps in the coming months and years, which is super exciting. There are consumer-facing incentives. This is the thing that I worked a lot on. So there are now $9 billion of rebate programs to help electrify and do efficiency upgrades for about 1 million homes in this country, which is exciting. There are tax credits. If you want to get a heat pump, you can get $2,000 off your heat pump. If you want to get an EV, you can get $4,000 off a used EV and up to $7,500 depending off a new one. And there's the Green Bank, which is currently being hashed out, but it's going to basically involve setting up banks where folks can apply for low or no cost financing to do projects, particularly in disadvantaged communities. And the majority of that money is earmarked for disadvantaged communities. There is somewhere between $40 to $60 billion for environmental justice. A little bit challenging to count it up. There's money, for example, for community block grants to help EJ groups participate in processes and also do projects that are priorities for EJ communities. There's money to clean up ports. And these were some of the things that the EJ NCP was working very hard to get into the package. And there's also $20 billion for cleaning up pollution from the agriculture sector and money to clean up heavy industry and a methane fee. So there's a lot of stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act. what did I work on? I worked on a really big program that died called the Clean Electricity Performance Program. The reason why I did that was because we wanted to try to split the utilities and the fossil fuel companies by basically centering benefits for utilities. So it was a program that would pay utilities to move faster on clean electricity and to move at the pace that was necessary to get to 100% clean power by 2035. When it died, I worked on a Saturday with a bunch of other folks, including in the Congressional Progressive Caucus, with, for example, Rep. Jayapal's staff, and tried to transform it into other things that will still deliver carbon pollution reductions. And I also worked a lot on the consumer-facing incentives to make clean energy cheaper, like, for example, the heat pump tax credits. What did we learn? Well, Michael Ross, who's a wonderful political scientist, who I edit a book series with at Cambridge, who's lovely, he said, I didn't write this, but I guess I stuck it on a slide. What can we learn about climate politics from the long overdue passage of the IRA? Two things: economists are wrong, political scientists are right. Basically what he was saying was, and then he went on to cite a bunch of papers that, like me and Jessica Green and Matt Mildenberger and other folks like himself, Michael Ross and Pasha Madavi wrote, and he said that, like, you know, focusing on sticks and carbon pricing was not the right solution, and giving people carrots was a better idea, basically, and that's what we were all saying that. Some last thoughts about why I think it passed. You know, in public policy, with Kingdon and Manchin Olson, we talk about solutions in search of a problem. This is this idea that we want to solve the climate change. We've got our solutions: clean electricity and electrification. And we need to find the problem of the day that will get that across the finish line. And it ended up being that inflation was the problem that we could sort of tag our thing onto. And that didn't surprise me, because I'd written some historical pieces looking at when we passed our, you know, PTC for wind and ITC for solar in the past, and it was during energy crises when energy was really expensive. I think that inside and outside relationships is really important. This is something I had learned about when I was studying things in my book, and it's so true that you have to build relationships with legislators, and that you can have massive impact if you have ideas and you kind of get to know folks. I mean, like I said, I didn't know almost anything about Congress or like know anybody in Congress, but because I worked with Sam Ricketts and he knew everyone, it kind of allowed us to build those relationships. I think also very consistent public and private messaging, holding the administration accountable, saying if they were going to walk back on anything or their ambition, that there was going to be anger from the Senate and from activists for that. I think the Sunrise Movement was really key in that too. And really shaping public opinion and politicians' perception of public opinion. What do they think the public wants? In my book, I developed this concept of the fog of enactment, which is this idea that people don't really know what's in a bill when it passes, and that is absolutely the case for the Inflation Reduction Act. But one thing I didn't know was the fight of enactment, so to speak, which was the anger and emotion when you actually have a bill on the table where you have to say, is this good enough or not? And you know, there wasn't nearly as much fracturing as we had seen in the environmental movement during Waxman Markey, but some groups were really angry. I got attacked. It was dramatic. It was not fun. But it just shows you that, like, actually having a bill on the table is when folks have to decide, is this good enough or not? And not everybody has the same calculus there. And finally, we often think of businesses as, like, you know, really smart and knowing what they want and knowing how to make money. But I really experienced that businesses were very status quo biased and did not see the potential opportunity here. For example, with the Defense Production Act, heat pump manufacturers were like, would you like hundreds of millions of dollars to set up a heat pump manufacturing facility in America with massive increased demand? And they're like, I don't know, that sounds like hard. And will there really be increased demand? Like, I don't know. And you're like, okay. Or for STEP, we're like, would you like $150 billion utility industry? And they're like, I don't know, that sounds like hard. So I find this very frustrating that a lot of corporations are not forward thinking, they're not taking the climate crisis seriously. And even when you create massive opportunities for them to do the right thing, sometimes they don't. So that brings me to the end of this long story. I found it interesting, and I'm happy to take questions.
No, it's just supposed to be on Saturday, and we can just ski in snow.
Friday afternoon, yeah.
Oh, well, we'll do that.
No, it's tonight. It's Friday. I mean, it's Friday night. and
Yes,
it's
in the
Saturday
back.
morning.
I just looked and it looks like Saturday.
Oh.
Yes.
Oh, she just finished her lecture. Okay, just got to see a lecture.
All junk.
And we're just going 8 minutes. It's an 8 minute,
I think that.
8 minute drive. And then we're just going from the city of, the town of Stowe
Yeah.
up to, what's it called? On tram.
Alright, so I gotta get my stuff
The
together.
10%, we'll get rid of it in 2 years, we'll get rid of it, we'll use an alternative that we know won't harm the environment. They dragged it out to 2050.
Yeah,
So 100% will go by 2050, hydrofluorocarbons, 4,000 times, and make chemical warming.
global warming potential, yes,
Causing global warming than carbon dioxide.
yes.
Have you worked on this? What can be done about this? Maybe.
Yeah, so I don't work,
Or something for
yeah,
causing drought and causing crop losses and something to scare the hell out of these people that are using this chemical. There's an alternative chemical there's a couple of alternative chemicals.
yes,
That is safe, that can be used for refrigeration.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these are like super pollutants, sometimes we call them. So one thing that they did, which is maybe what you're talking about, is there was actually a bipartisan agreement on the Kigali Amendment, ratifying the Kigali Amendment, which Republicans also voted on, and was a really big lift to get that over the finish line because it had to be with 60 votes in the Senate. You may feel that it doesn't go far enough, and that is valid. And this is a very big problem, and you're right, there are often chemicals to replace them with. So that's a part of the climate pollution problem that's in that last 25% that I was not speaking about as much, and that's not the area that I work on as much, but it's a very important problem to look at, and we did see some action from Congress on it in the last Congress, but it's going to be something that we're going to have to think more about, including in refrigerants, because for example, heat pump has these in them, and we have to think about low global warming potential coolants to put in those heat pumps too. California is working a little bit on this as well. So yeah, we will come across new problems as we solve other problems, and so it will go along. But the climate problem is a very big problem, and we have to really get on top of it. Oh, wow, now we have so many questions. Kim, I'm going to give you a question.
Thank you. I was curious about your last talking points, noting your interactions with industry and how you found them just kind of like status quo champions or inertial, right?
Yes.
But at face value in the media, for example, we see every day pronouncements from all kinds of different private sectors and industries about climate pledges and consortium letter writing to the administration and blah, blah, blah. I mean, is that all greenwashing, or in your experience of this inside view, were there lobbying instruments in play during that time?
Yeah.
And if so, I'd love to hear how that worked.
Yeah, Senator Whitehouse has actually been the most vocal critic of this. He loves to go on about how corporations never show up and they make these pledges, and then the most important thing they could do is lobby for climate, and they don't. This is what Senator Whitehouse would tell you if you asked him. And I think it's true. There are some business groups like Ceres who worked really hard to get folks there. And there were some, I think the auto manufacturers actually have made a huge stride in terms of becoming more positive. I think they're just like, actually EVs work and people love them, and I guess we should sell those. So that's great. The fact that we don't have the auto industry and the fossil fuel industry and, the utility industry opposed, or some of them split, as we had with Wax and Markey, I think that that's been a really big deal. But I did not see even tech companies, for example, really throw the full weight behind the bill. So that's frustrating. But I think it's still better than it's been in the past. But no, it's not as good as I would hope. And I'm sure Senator Whitehouse would say the same thing. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how you see this unfolding over sort of 10 years or so? I mean, what do you see as a potential for continuing momentum and possibilities for stalling? And in the momentum side, what happens, often after a movement gets something, they go home. And so
Yes.
to what extent will the movement, how important do you think the ongoing inside-outside game will
Yeah.
be to really achieve the goals?
Yeah, well, those are all points I make in my book, so I totally am in agreement with you. We have the potential for retrenchment, and we have to make sure that we get as much money out the door as effectively as possible, as quickly as possible. And it's interesting because a lot of this money is going to go to Republican and conservative rural areas, so that could start to really change the politics of the issue, where those companies actually get money from clean technologies and not just from the polluters, because as again Senator Whitehouse says, the Republican Party is kind of bought and paid for right now by the fossil fuel industry, especially after Citizens United. And so if we can have other corporate interests talking to them, employing people in their districts, that could really start to shift the politics. And I do feel that implementation is where the rubber really hits the road. If the thought of enactment is like you don't really know what's in the bill, what's in the bill becomes realized in the implementation phase. And right now, the administration is going through what's called an RFI process, request for information, where groups write memos and they say, here's what you should do on this thing or this thing. And I'm engaged in some programs that I worked on that I have particular bones to pick on, is trying to make that as strong as possible. And lots of groups are doing that. So I think that the movement is actually showing up in a really big way for implementation. And the philanthropic community is as well. They're planning to mobilize huge amounts of money into the space to make sure that the climate movement doesn't kind of like collapse under the wind, which we see a lot in movements. And again, that urgency of that 2030 deadline, I think, is part of it, right? Because people know that if we don't maximize these investments, we're not going to really get another chance. So I'm hopeful. I'm sure there will be problems, but it's kind of a time will tell sort of situation. Yes, in the yellow and black.
So after the Inflation Reduction Act passed, there's a lot more focus on like state and local policy for mobilizing those funds. And I think in coordination with that, and also with the fact that there's a Democratic president, and also with just general activist tendencies, there's more of a trend towards reducing the national effort. Like Sunrise basically eliminated its national policy office. A lot of climate groups are trying to organize between states as opposed to in Washington. And so on one hand, I feel like that could help mobilize those funds. On the other hand, it sort of leaves, it definitely doesn't leave a vacuum, but there's less of a busy space in Washington. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, different groups play different roles, and I think that Sunrise is very good at agenda setting, and they may say that if that's what we're good at, there's not an agenda to be set right now in DC. The work that's happening on implementation right now federally is like really technical, super boring, involves lawyers telling you, well, how could you interpret the executive order that way? And you're like, because that's what the executive order says. And if you look at paragraph, it's grinding kind of work, and that may not be what Sunrise is best set up to do, right? So I do think that we rebuilt a lot of federal infrastructure pretty quickly for this moment because folks saw the opportunity and didn't want to lose out on it. And it may actually make strategic sense for folks to think about working in states or getting other bills passed. Because, for example, we have these huge budget surpluses in like Minnesota and Massachusetts, and Democratic governors and Democratic trifectas where we could actually pass more climate policy. So it may make sense to actually pivot towards state work, while some groups who have the implementation acumen have to stay focused federally. Yes, over there.
What do you think of the need for permitting reform in addition to all this? Like, that's like the key, and what do you think of the prospects for that passing in the current Congress?
I am blessed to not be an expert on permitting reform. It's a blessed situation for me. I'm not an expert in NEPA. I think that Abby Dillon at Earth Justice is a lawyer who, runs a 700-person organization. And she points out that NEPA is not the main bottleneck to a lot of these projects moving forward in a timely fashion. I think that's a valid point. I think, though, if you look at, for example, congestion pricing in New York City, NEPA has actually been part of the barrier in that particular case. So there may be some cases where NEPA is a challenge. But I think the problem is when you open up an environmental law to Congress, especially in this Congress, that may not be a good thing. The package that was put together in the fall, I did not support. It had the Mountain Valley Pipeline in it and a bunch of other stuff. And I think the movement was really fractured after, because the Inflation Reduction Act did not have that much bad stuff in it. There was some bad stuff, do not get me wrong, but not that much. A lot of it went in this companion bill, and people were really upset about, for example, greenlighting a pipeline permit through Congress. And that's not really like a good due process to do that in the first place. So I do not support that. But in general, I am not the world's expert on permitting reform. And so I don't have to really have an opinion on that. And that works for me. I've had a lot of opinions in my time. So yes.
To go back to thinking about these sort of like areas for a second. I feel like a lot of the climate action strategy thinking has focused around the idea that if we get like a Green New Deal or policies like the Inflation Reduction Act that pour money into these towns to go to green energy, they will inevitably see the benefits and come over and start, voting in favor of climate policies and stuff because as it benefits them economically. But in the past, we've seen it with things like health policy and among other things. There have been a lot of forces, predominantly like whiteness theory and stuff that have seen that like a lot of these pockets of voters, which are a large part of America, will actively vote against their own interests.
Yes.
Because of a variety of reasons. So what do you think is the most impactful, most effective way of like packaging these messages to appeal to these voter bases in order to get them to actually switch over?
Well, I think that there's increasing work on the right to center climate change within the Republican Party. It's very hard work. I'm not jealous of people trying to do that work. That's not easy work. But I think that they are trying to think about, where is this money going? How are we building even technologies that on the left we don't like, right? For example, critical mineral extraction is not super popular. Hydrogen, CCS, right? Not super popular, but some of these things are going to be going into conservative districts. And it could be that you start to have a Republican view on what climate solutions are that is a real solution, so to speak, or more close to real than like, let's plant 1 billion trees, which was their plan under the Trump administration. So, I think that we could start to see different technologies be favored, for example, nuclear by the Republican Party. And I do think that when you have people employed in like a manufacturing plant in your district, it's going to be really hard to have a representative or a senator say, yeah, I'm going to gut the program that employs like 10,000 people in my district. Like, probably not. And it's going to be very important to mobilize those workers. Alex Turtle Fernandez wrote a book called Politics at Work, which is a lot about how workers can be mobilized in politics. And so like companies can literally ask their employees, will you like reach out to your member of Congress? Are you going to vote? And so if some of that mobilization can be happening in clean energy technologies and not just in dirty industries, then that could really start to change the dynamics. Yes.
Did your spreadsheets include employment estimates?
Well, my spreadsheets, they weren't mine. Those were Senator Schumer's spreadsheets. And no, I don't think so. That's the next wave. This is
when you talk about tens of thousands of jobs in these manufacturing facilities, is that estimated?
Yes. So that's the next spreadsheet, so to speak. So you're 2 steps ahead. Exactly. So let's now map where's all the money going and how many jobs are being created. And so Climate Power has done a first cut at that. And what happens is when these facilities get announced, they make an estimate of jobs. And so that's like sort of step one. And then there's a group called Atlas Public Policy, which is going to they're a very detailed factual based organization. They're going to do a post hoc analysis to see how many jobs were actually created. This is also of interest to unions, for example. They want to know where are the jobs. So yeah, that's pretty difficult work, but it's really important work. And instead what we've had so far, which is again important, but not as robust, so to speak, just because it hadn't passed yet, was folks at the University of Massachusetts, I want to say Amherst, did really interesting modeling about how many jobs the package could create. That was funded by the Sierra Club, for example. So folks were trying to talk about jobs, and now they're sort of tracking announcements. And the next stage is really to track actual jobs and companies and have those companies be mobilized and really try to hold the policy in place in that way. Yes.
Thank you for a really interesting and inspiring talk. My question is sort of institutional, the Suzanne Mettler thesis that everything gets submerged into the tax code.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about the role that reconciliation plays, and if there were policies that could have been passed that you think the political support was behind, but that had to be cut either by the parliamentarian or ahead of time by policy advocates, just because it had to go through something substantially related to the budget.
I think more things were cut because of Senator Manchin than because of the parliamentarian or because of reconciliation. I mean, reconciliation does take a lot of things off the table. You know, you can't just make a program that's not budgetary, but I think there was mostly a focus on spending in the first place. I mean, maybe we could have done more strengthening of regulations, for example, and standards. You could have passed a traditional clean electricity standard, for example, if it wasn't through budget reconciliation. But the reason why that didn't happen was because Senator Manchin opposed the payment plan version of it, not because the parliamentarian said it wasn't allowed or something like that. So yeah, I think that to go back to the other question too, you know, it could be that folks don't connect these benefits back to the state like Suzanne Mettler shows in her work. And so it's going to be important that there's companies and organizing infrastructure, unions, for example, that make the connection between a law and jobs, for example, and make a connection between a law and benefits and local economic activity, and then organize to go talk to members of Congress, including Republicans, and explain that. Because, you know, we can't expect everyday Americans to know what the Inflation Reduction Act is or particularly care. But what we can do is market it to people and say, like, would you like an electric vehicle? Did you know you can now get this much money off? And that's one of the things that Rewiring America, where I also work, is doing. Like, we're partnering with a lot of different companies like Airbnb, for example, to market through their networks of all the hosts. Like, would you like to electrify your home? Like, here's how you do it. Here's the money that's available. So using networks to communicate that these benefits are available and getting more people to adopt them will also increase the amount of money that we spend, increase the amount of carbon pollution we reduce, will increase the amount of jobs we create. So the better job we can do implementing and sort of spreading the gospel of like what's available, then the better, you know, this will all go in the end. Yes.
Okay, I have a question about your experience working in the inside-outside game.
Yes.
So I'm kind of curious how critical you think it is that the organizations that are playing the outside game actually have any kind of membership or people associated with it, or is the smoke and mirrors effect of basically mobilizing a bunch of people or showing up to a protest with a small handful, is that sufficient? I know that's kind of like a debate among organizations, and how critical is it to be member based? So I'm curious your experience actually working with that and seeing this policy through. Was the smoke and mirrors sufficient, or did the groups actually need membership bases?
That's a very insightful question. You know, the largest membership-based organization is the Sierra Club. And I have a lot of admiration for the Sierra Club. I've worked with them. They're an amazing organization. They now have new leadership, which is super exciting. But during this time period, the Sierra Club was going through really hard times. They lost like more than a third of their staff. They didn't really have a leader. They were having a lot of internal reckoning. I was talking about this earlier, but if you read like the work of Maurice Mitchell, he wrote this, I mean, yeah, you know, you're on my wavelength. It's so good. If you can read one thing, you should go read his article about movements. It's in Convergence magazine, just like Maurice Mitchell Convergence. Click. So good. You can also listen to like him talk on podcasts too if you can't read, but I support reading. Anyway, they were kind of having internal problems. And so, you know, I often called them up and was like, hey guys, would you like to call, get your members to call? And I'm a Sierra Club member. So I was like, I haven't seen you try to ask me to call Congress yet. How about you try to ask me and a majillion other people to call Congress? And there was like, oh, I don't know if it's the right time. And I think they were very worried about like supporting a package and what was in it and when was the right moment. And having such a huge membership-based organization not at the tip-top shape at that moment was rough, to be honest. So instead, we relied on more regional groups who had smaller memberships, but still memberships, like the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. Love them. Oh my gosh. Quentin Scott and Jamie DeMarco and Mike Tidwell. Love those people. They, you know, they mobilized real people. And then Jamie went in front of the White House and like burned his high school diploma one day. I was like, okay, Jamie, cool. Like very creative activist organizing. Also the climate, what am I going to say? Climate Action Network. Is that what I'm saying? CCAN? CCAN. No, sorry, I'm getting confused because I'm talking about CCAN and CAN. So the Climate Action Network as well, which is a grassroots group, they did protests. The Sunrise Movement, of course, has actual people and did place-based work. The Sunrise Movement did these marches actually in the Gulf Coast and in California. One of my students was part of that. So, you know, it's not always necessarily like, of course, they also did the hunger strike after the Clean Electricity Performance Program died, which was like a heart-wrenching, brutal time for those of us, like, because I helped design that program, and then when it died, I felt like so much responsibility for these kids like starving themselves. Yeah, it was dramatic, exactly. And so anyway, there was real grassroots effort, and there was also smoke and mirrors, and it was both, you know, and it's kind of always like that, you know, and then the corporations do that with astroturfing on steroids. So at least we have real people and real public opinion and the planet on our team, even if we have a little smoke and mirrors too.
Thanks, Leah. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I know we've had a student who's been very
Oh, I'm so
patient
sorry.
asking. Yeah.
Yes, please.
It's okay. I have kind of a question along the similar lines, but on like the inside.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about your role specifically as an academic, because there are a lot of academics in the room, in shaping the inside of the bill. Because you've alluded a lot of the time to like how inaccessible the actual bill text is, right? Like the average American's not gonna understand the IRA, et cetera, et cetera. But yet there's also an incredible importance in having like grassroots organizers involved in actually crafting the bill text. And so my question is two parts, is that one, in your experience with it, what was kind of like the weight distribution between different inside party involved, like academics versus business interests versus grassroots organizers? Like I know Varsity Prakash was there, right? But then also within implementation, right, there's a lot of questions about like how specifically like the EJ funds are going to be distributed, right? And so like what is then the balance of those different groups between academia and business and policymakers, and then on the ground organizers handling like the inside intricate details that are inaccessible to the general public, but are yet like so crucial to have general public insight on?
Yeah. It really depended on the program. You know, a lot of the EJ work was spearheaded by EJNCP and its membership. That includes a lot of grassroots EJ groups. You know, the Clean Electricity Performance Program that I worked a lot on, and other parts of the clean electricity work, we held a really open process. Anybody could join, including grassroots groups. The only price of membership was that you believed in a clean electricity standard and you wanted to get it passed. If you believe in those things, you can come. And so we ran a really open process. Sometimes that led to conflict because folks didn't believe in a clean electricity standard. They're like, you know, what about biomass and what about CCS? And folks had different substantive takes on, you know, what would this policy do? Would it do good or harm or things like that? So it was conflictual and difficult, but it was a very open process, including the policy design process. We had open meetings that anybody could come to and, you know, talk about, and there were different groups came up with different ideas, and we tried to take input from different ideas. So I think it was a far more open policymaking process than it has been in the past. And, you know, but there were different groups involved. I think, you know, if you look, for example, at the Green Bank, there was a nonprofit that was really involved in getting that on the agenda. The Sunrise Movement worked a lot on the Civilian Climate Corps, which of course didn't end up in the final bill. So different groups picked up different pieces, is what I would say, and pushed them forward. And they had their different levels of openness, and it wasn't a lot of academics involved at all. I would say like me, Jesse Jenkins, maybe some others I'm forgetting in this moment, but it's not really academics. And I really was participating like an organizer, not at the grassroots level, but at the sort of movement level. Like, okay, let's bring everybody together in a meeting and let's talk about it. So yeah, and I tried to do some of that grassroots work with like the phone calling and stuff like that too, in places where I felt like there was holes not being filled.
Terrific. Thank you so much. May not be the outrageously most cute person in the room, and I think that
Yes,
more
that's
might go
over
over
there.
here. And no, John, I'm not talking about you. But she is certainly just an incredible advocate and academic on this topic, and I'm so delighted that you could come join us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you
Thanks
again
for all the
for,
questions. It was great. Lovely to meet all of you.